Hello and welcome to a new episode of The Ramp. Today we are super excited that we have Marta Bisisi with us from Superside. She's a VP of talent over there and she's ready to share her thoughts on remote work with us. Very happy and excited to have you here today, Marta. Welcome to the show.
Thank you, Thor. Thank you very much for having me.
Cool. Pleasure having you. I want to maybe spend a couple of minutes on understanding more about what Superside is and more about your organization and how you're organized. So feel free to give us a brief elaboration.
Yeah, lovely. So as you said, I'm the VP talent in Superside. So in Superside, I oversee everything that is somehow people related. And to describe a little bit what Superside does, we are a creative as a service company, and we serve customers with everything they need regarding advertising creative or brand design or video production. And today we are working with around 450 companies, brands in the world. We are a fully remote company, around 650, 700-ish people. And we are located in 70 countries worldwide. So not only remote, but also very, very international.
Big operation. Could you tell us a little bit more about when you started at Superside? How many were you at that time? What type of challenges did you have? Where are you today compared to when you started?
Yeah, that's a very, very cool story. So I joined Superside in March 2020. A very peculiar moment also to join a company. And at that time, remote work was not that common. When I first told my friends, my family, I was going to work for a remote company, everybody were like, we don't really understand how does that work. That sounds very, very peculiar. So I joined at that time, and we were around 100 people, probably something more. But the company was extremely different. We were building everything. I joined the talent team in Superside, and there was almost nothing there. So it was a very, very cool moment to join, because we had basically a blank slate where to start build stuff. And of course, it was a great new experience. I come from consulting, so I had done some people projects before, but that has never been my focus. And I think that has been a great advantage for me to help the company grow and build people processes that were different, probably different from what the traditional HR world does. And so we started there 100 people, and then we went through a very fast hypergrowth period where we had to focus a lot on recruitment, and we had to basically build a plane as we were flying and figure out all the processes, how to make things work, how things were different in a remote environment versus office-based as we went. And today, I have to say I'm very proud of what we've done. So 3 years later, I now have a much bigger and more structured team. We have very different, very specific teams that engage with people topics, and everything is much more organized. But what I really like is that I still see that fire than when we started, right? We still see everything we can do, and very, very exciting.
Cool. Now that's we work with a lot of companies, and I've not seen as fast growth as I have seen with Superside. So people talk about super scaling or scaling super fast. When we're talking about 30 to 50 hires a year, but I from my understanding, at least your numbers were insane during at least a couple of years since after you started. So Could you elaborate on like share some numbers there and also
Yeah,
how you practically manage to hire that many people?
absolutely. So to share some numbers, when I joined the company, we were hiring 3, 4 people, I guess, per month, 5 people. And I still
Mm,
remember my technical test to join the company. And the test said, think
mm,
about how to scale it to 25 people. And that sounded already when I joined, a very challenging, exercise. With time, we got to moments where we onboarded 64, 65 people per month. That was probably the peak.
mm,
So yeah, things changed there. How did we do it? Well, first of all, we tried to develop to build a team that could manage that, and we started thinking
mm,
about what were the type of roles we were recruiting for. Because in
mm,
Superside, being a creative company, there are a lot of creative roles to be hired for, and they are the engine of the company. So, of course, most of the
mm,
hires in terms of numbers usually belong to those teams. And then there's everything else, all the other
mm,
roles that make the company work, from finance, legal, talent, marketing, etc. So first of all, the first thing that we figured out was that we had to manage these type of roles differently. On one side, we were basically recruiting for the same role or very similar profiles over and over again, while in other cases, the role were very um, specific, niche, one-time roles. So first of all, we understood that there was a different way of recruiting for these two big areas, and then we defined processes accordingly. And in particular, for those parts of the business where recruitment was recurring, was high volume for very specific roles, we made sure that we could scale the recruitment process, not only using the talent acquisition team, but using people that currently are working in the same role. And the idea behind that is that we cannot scale the recruitment team with the same pace
mm,
that the company is growing, but those teams are
mm,
scaling exactly at that pace. So if you leverage them, then the process is scalable by definition. And that's
mm,
where we started involving more and more the actual teams in the recruitment process. So, for example, all first interviews were done by people that were in the team. So, if we were hiring for creatives or we were hiring for project managers, the first chat was done with one person that was already in the team.
mm,
And that was good for us because, of course, from a process point of view, we were that was much more scalable. But also
mm.
for candidate experience, because meeting a recruiter is great, but meeting the person that does the job you're applying for is even better.
Mm. Makes sense. No, but that is sounds like a complex challenge because when you're hiring at that scale, you also want to maintain quality, right? So how did you ensure that people, both recruiters and also people doing those interviews, the professionals or the designers themselves, understood where the hiring bar should be? Was that through using tests or was it having structured interview guides or yeah, how do you sort of
Yes.
set the hiring bar at scale? Because that must be challenging.
Yeah, I think a combination of what you just said, right? So, first
Mm,
of all, yes, we have structured interview setup. So we have very clear
mm,
um, indication of which are the competencies that we want to test in which step of the process. Make sure we are not overlapping, right? So we test one thing once, or sometimes we test it twice if we think it's really relevant. But what is important is to
mm,
define exactly what is the goal for each step of the recruitment process and make sure that we have
mm,
as a standard as possible way of evaluating that. So clarifying
mm,
exactly what are the questions that we're going to ask, what is the type of answers that we expect from candidates. So that is one part that is very process oriented. On top of this, we also have the same standard testing that we share with everybody. So that's another level of evaluation that is consistent for all the candidates. And on top of that, we have technical assessments with one specific scorecards, where again we explain very well how the scoring should happen. So that is a whole part that probably is more about how we design it. And then there's a second part, which is training everybody to do so. So making sure that everybody is actually able to use all of these systems, right? And how we do it, we developed a training program. We train batches of these teams as we go. And in this training process, we explain what is the philosophy, what is the type of hire we're looking for. We explain also what are the most common questions they might receive, etc., etc. And the very important part of this training is active, exercise, where you interview people and you test it and you try it. So that is an important part. So you build the process, you train everybody, and then you also need to make sure that there's a uniform way of doing it, right? You have to make sure this happens in real life. And how we do is we shadow interviews here and there. We review the scorecards. We review how tests are assessed every now and then to make sure that this is actually happening. And then we give additional feedback or additional training to those recruiters that need that.
Cool. But that's sounds quite structured and a good way of doing it. We're a big believer in structure and data when it comes to recruitment. So glad when you elaborate on the process. How do you understand if you manage to actually follow that hiring bar and ensuring that the people that the 65, for example, you've onboarded in 1 month, that they are as good hires as you hope for? Is that client feedback? Is it peer feedback? Do you then go back to the model and iterate after you've received feedback?
Yes. So all the people that get hired go through a first period where they have very specific goals. So the standard 30 days, 60 days, 90 days goals, right? And that period is a period where the hiring manager is highly involved. And the goal of that period is to, first of all, confirm what we've seen in the recruitment process. So make sure that those competencies we're looking for are actually there, but also evaluate other two areas that usually happen in the recruitment process, but are a little bit more difficult to test, which is culture fit and the ability to actually achieve the results of the role. So during this period, the manager has all of this evaluation. And of course, it's done through the manager evaluation, but also peer feedback that the manager receives. And so at the end of these 90 periods, we usually have an idea if the person is gonna progress in Superside or not, which means if we did a good hire or not. So the percentage of people that pass that part is one of the elements we look at to understand if we are doing it right. And then other things we look is on the other side, right? When something doesn't work, when somebody joins Superside and for some reason they don't work, they don't like the company, or we don't like how we are working with them. And in that case, we usually have a retro meeting where we sit down and we say what we didn't see, why we didn't see it. And usually the possibilities are a couple. Either we didn't test for it at all. And then the point is, should we add that? Like, should this be one of the things we test for in the recruitment process? Or maybe we tested for it, but we didn't get it. So in this case, we go back and we look at how the scorecard is built, which is the type of answer we're looking for. Is it still coherent with what we're looking for? And on top of this, I think I told you about roles that we always recruit for and are always generally coherent. But the truth is also those roles and the expectations for those roles change as Superside grows and the strategy changes. So on top of this, there's also a recurrent moment when we sit down and we say, hey, is the profile we are recruiting for still the same we need for Superside in 2 years, in 3 years? So there's also this check.
Thank you so much for sharing. We've talked now a lot about the recruitment process and assessment process, but I assume you were also a bit stressed when you heard the targets from the CEO and how you're going to really attract that many candidates. So on the sourcing and the talent attraction side, how do you even sort of yeah the starts to be able to build that machinery of talent acquisition? That's
Yeah.
something I want to learn a bit more about.
So first of all, yes, of course. When you hear, how many hires you need to do, it's always a little bit like, will we ever be able to get there, right? And when you scale, the targets change continuously, and maybe you feel like, oh, we've done well. We recruited 20 people, but you realize you need many, many more. So absolutely, the feeling at the beginning was like, whoa, will we ever be able to do this? But then I think it's a matter of, trying to approach the problem step by step, right? So in some situations, there are markets that are huge, right, by definition. And in that case, the problem is um, understanding how to filter them and understanding how to approach them. While there are other cases where talent is scarce and you need to understand what are those 2-3 things that really attract them. And there, for example, there's a lot of work done by the employer marketing team about understanding what's the best message, right? What is the most effective outreach message that you should send out? And we do it really with trial and error, or if you want to say it more nicely, A/B testing. So we send out different messages and we figure out what works best, right? And so we understand that, for example, for specific type of roles, whenever you mention strategy or innovation, they're going to be extremely attracted to it. There are other roles for which we understand that mentioning, maybe naming the names of our investors was very attractive. For others, maybe, in particular the creative roles, they really want to know about the brands we work with. So it's really working on it and figuring out what is most attractive at any time, and working with that. Right now, I need to say I'm extremely proud of the work we've done. Our current reply rate on outreach is 38%, which is pretty high. Of course, different role by role, but LinkedIn analytics tell us this is the number, and but really, it's not a result you get overnight. It's really an exercise of trying to understand what works best. Also, the feedback that we receive from the candidates. So there's also a lot of collaboration between the employer marketing team and the talent acquisition team, right? Because talent acquisition maybe says, "Hey, I realized that when I ask the question, why did you apply or why are you interested?" Candidates always repeat that. So that might be one of the things that we want to test. And we progress that way, role by role, trying to figure out what works best, and knowing that maybe the same strategy doesn't work all the time. And as the market changes, things that were working before are not working anymore. So it's a never-ending exercise, but very interesting.
I'm just so impressed by the numbers that you have managed to recruit to the company. So what would be maybe interesting for the listener here is understanding which roles were difficult and which were easier. So just understanding you're also hiring globally, right? So also which markets perform well. Where's the honeypot of talent for you guys? That's fascinating to learn a bit more about.
Yes. So in general, easy and hard have a very, there are many elements that make a role easy or hard. In general, for example, when we recruit for a role that is standard in the industry, in the world, like we are hiring for account executives, or we are hiring for I don't know, digital marketing specialists. The role is clear, and everybody talks about that role in the same way. You're hiring for an HR business partner. It's the same everywhere. So it's generally easier because there's a title that connects almost one-to-one, almost to what you're looking for. So you understand very well that that title brings some competencies together, and that's what we are looking for. Where it becomes a little bit more tricky is when you build a role that doesn't exist. This is very common in Superside. We are trying to do something that is different from other companies. So sometimes you imagine a role, and you almost also come up with a interesting, new title, right? That doesn't exist in the market. And sometimes it's an hybrid between two roles, right? So you have to be a little bit smarter, maybe, source for both roles and then both titles that make this, ideal profile, and then figure out which are those candidates that are more in between and have some of the competences of the other one. So usually, easy when you have a standard role, easy to hire for, easier to hire for. Not standard role, different title, something you came up with, more difficult. Also because in the first case, the inbound channel works pretty well. In the second case, it doesn't, because people don't know what they're looking for. So that one is an element. And then I think what makes a role more or less easy or difficult is what's your expertise in that. So every time you spend a lot of time recruiting for the same role, then by definition that role becomes easier, because every time a candidate tells you that they do something, they do an activity, you understand exactly what they're talking about, and you don't have to go deeper and really try to understand, etc. While if you've never recruited for a role, it's much more difficult. So there's this part of expertise building that really helps. And then of course, the more senior you go, the more difficult it is. There are fewer people and more difficult to attract. They're usually happy where they are, so that adds up to the pile. And then you said where we recruit, which are markets that work very well for us. So in general, when we recruit, we start thinking about time zones, which might be weird for somebody that is not used to fully remote and fully international. But whenever we start recruiting, we try to understand what is the time zone that we need, where this person, these new candidates, needs to be located. And for Superside, most of the hires, not all of them, but most of the hires happen in the European and US time zone. That is the area. And I think the countries where we found a very, very good talent is one, South Africa for sure. It's currently the biggest country for population in Superside. So South African talent is great. They speak amazing English, very, very high level of education, and also they have a, for us, interesting creative market. So very, very good talent there. But the same is true for Latin America. Very great creative talent there. And actually, there's also a lot of people that speak English, even if it's not the main language. So I think these markets have been great for us. We found great talents there.
Good. No, thank you for sharing, and great tips there on locations. I also want to know if you have like you mentioned both the outbound and the inbound part of it. So any, I don't know if you need to share any numbers, but in general, what's the trend that you've seen throughout this scale up? Is it a matter of balancing both, or did you see for specific roles that inbound. Yeah, you mentioned it that inbound work for specific roles, but just trying to understand,
Yeah.
especially with the inbound part of it, how did you make that machinery work in terms of the distribution of job ads in different markets, different roles? I've seen a lot of companies try to advertise roles, but not getting the inbound traction that they want. So, would love to hear some tips
Yes.
there and what worked for you for Supersite.
Yes. So first of all, if I think about what are the main channels we get candidates from, one is referral, one is outbound, and one is inbound. And I mentioned them in this order because this is the order how from most effective to least effective, but also from lowest volume to highest volume. So if I think about the numbers, right now I saw the numbers yesterday. Around 4%, 5% of our hires come from the referral channel, and then we have a good 70% that come from outsourced, and the rest is inbound. So you understand that the importance of the outbound channel is huge. So as a rule in Superside, we always open the outbound channel for every role we recruit for, and we sometimes open the inbound channel for some of the roles we recruit for. And the reason is probably connected to what I told you before. When you're recruiting for a standard role in the market, you get good applications because they know what they're looking for, and the title is very telling. Whenever you're trying to recruit for a profile with that is new or different, usually the inbound channel doesn't work that well because not even the candidates understand exactly what you're looking for. And there's something to be said and some work to be said about crafting the right job description and making sure the information is there. So there's a lot of work to be done there that can improve this. But based on my experience, when a role is very specific and not standard, usually the outbound channel works best. And in terms of where we advertise, so LinkedIn, first of all, is a very big channel for us. Unfortunately, LinkedIn still didn't develop the remote location, so you have to advertise in multiple countries, and that's what we do. So sometimes if you go to our LinkedIn profile, you're gonna see the same role hired in 10 countries, but the truth is we are hiring for one person, and we are open to find this person everywhere, right? So
It's a business hack there, Marta. It's 10x revenue for LinkedIn. That's
for sure
why they're not fixing that.
for sure. That's a point of discussion every time we meet our LinkedIn account managers. Like, this doesn't work. So LinkedIn for sure. And then you can also leverage some other job boards that both those that advertise that are specialized on remote jobs and those that are a little bit more local, even if not specialized. Again, what works best is when you're hiring for roles that are standard and usually also slightly junior. The very senior roles you don't feel inbound, right? You'll never have a VP of product, VP of tech apply to a job, right? You have to hunt them. But for junior roles with standard titles, that works. And again, the strategy there is playing around a little bit with what is the main target for those job boards. For us in particular, the geography is important because if we are recruiting for somebody that needs to work with the US customers and this person is located in Australia, it won't work. So when we publish a role, we need to be very careful also with time zone.
Good. No, makes sense. I was also a bit curious about how COVID has affected Superside. And by that, I mean, um, pre-COVID, remote was a bit exotic and different, but post-COVID, it seems a bit more commoditized. So what maybe was a super unique selling point for you, maybe is more difficult to differentiate on now, or we're looking more at the hybrid, and some companies are moving fully back to the office. But in general, I would say it's more of a remote movement has obviously increased. So how does that play to your positioning in the employer brand?
Yes. I see personally three phases here, right? Before COVID or just right when COVID hit, then right after, meaning, maybe 2021, 2022, and now. So when I started recruiting for Superside, yes, COVID was already here, but remote was still, not a thing. And for sure, this was a big selling point. But also, when I remember, I always ask a question during recruitment processes, and I ask, why remote? How do you feel about working for a remote company? And people were in for sure curious about it, but also a little bit scared. They said, I don't know, I'm not sure if I can do it. I've never done it. So there was a lot of curiosity for sure, but also a little bit of
Really?
fear of how does that work? Can it even work? Right? All of that. And then, so COVID arrived, and actually a lot of companies had to force remote work. And people started trying it. And so in the second phase, there was again this moment where I was asking, why a remote job? Are you sure you want a remote job? And people were like, yes, I've been doing it and I think it's great. So that honestly helped. Also, I think there was a lot more people that were much more convinced of the fact that remote work is not for them. Like I remember a lot of people answering to my outreach messages and in my interviews said, no, I'm sorry, I cannot do remote. I need to go to the office, right? So probably there's a little bit less fear and more understanding of what remote work means and if you like or don't like that part of the job. So instead of saying of receiving the answer, I don't know, I have to try, sounds cool, but I don't know. Now I started receiving answers that said, oh yes, I've been doing it for the past 8 months, 9 months, a year, and I like it. I know it is. I want it. And then now again, another shift happened where a lot of companies are going back to the office or at least in an hybrid setup. So maybe they ask you to come back once per week, twice per week, depending on the company. And a lot of people are intentionally changing job and looking for fully remote companies because they don't want that. So again, it's probably a selling point for us because they people that want that strongly know that in Superside things won't change. It would be a nightmare to change. 70 countries, difficult. And also they know that this is exactly what they want. So I have to say it remained a selling point for different reasons. But it remained a selling point, and probably my perception is that it's a much more valuable selling point now than it was 3 years ago, even if now there are more companies that offer this.
Cool. Oh, that was very, very insightful and very interesting. I like how you divide it into three, and it seems very much an opportunity for you now to grasp when it comes to those candidates who don't want to go back to the office, and that
Absolutely.
sounds like you're well positioned for success with your fully remote setup. We've now talked a bit about talent attraction, a bit on the employer brand side, but also the assessment part. But it must be also both an operational and cultural pain in a way to onboard that many people at the same time for so many different locations and cultures, and in a company where the culture, I assume, is quite formative period with the scale up. So how do you create and onboard people to the Superside way or culture? What does that look like?
Mhm. Yes. So again, big topic, right? Onboarding people remote, very, very particular. So yes, we have an onboarding program. First of all, we onboard the people once per month at the beginning of the month, the first Monday of the month, usually, unless there's, an operational emergency somewhere. But usually it's the first Monday of the month. And we have a pretty structured first week of onboarding where everybody goes through the same experience. And the goal of that experience is, there are multiple goals. First one is make them acquainted with the company, our principles, our values. Frederick, our CEO, sits down once per month for an hour and a half with all the people that join the company, and with them goes through what is our vision, what is our mission, why we do what we do, all our principles, why we have those principles, etc., etc., and has a meet the CEO session where everybody can ask questions and understand. So this part where we share our principles, our mission, why we are here, why we do what we do, is a very big part of the onboarding process. And I think it's especially important in a remote environment where you just cannot feel the culture just walking around the corridors or meeting people at the coffee machine, right? Somebody has to tell you about it. So this is a very, very important part and first thing that happens on your first day during the onboarding program. And then during that week, you get introduced to all the different departments in the company. And we explain in general how Superside works and how each team works. And everybody goes through this, because we really believe that no matter where you are in the company, it's super important to understand what other teams are doing, how everybody contributes to the goals and the objectives of the company. And all of these sessions are led by Superside leaders. So usually it's the department leader that leads that session. Again, you probably understand the investment of Superside in this, because taking, 1 hour, an hour and a half of many directors, many VPs once per month to talk about this is quite an investment. But again, we really, really believe is extremely important. Also to start show our face. It's so easy in a remote environment to think about, maybe the CEO or the VP or the leader of that department to be like, a distant figure. Well, it's extremely important that you see them, you meet them. And then the last part is trying to build bonds, human bonds among the people that are joining together. So we have some moments where people need to go through quick group exercises, or we have speed dating session at the beginning where you have to meet everybody. We are intentionally trying to build human connections in the people that are joining, for two reasons mainly. One, because it's easier and it's less scary to join a new job if you have a friend or somebody that does it with you, right? And again, in a remote environment, being alone in a room in front of a screen and this new company expects something from you, it can be tricky, right? So we are trying to build the human bonds so that it feels less scary. And the second part is we are trying to facilitate connections among the teams. So maybe there are two people that get to know each other, they become friends during the onboarding program, and they belong to very different teams. We still believe that the bond that they create during that week will facilitate somehow communication among those teams, in the future, because maybe you discuss with your team and say, oh, we really need to involve finance in this, or we really need to involve that other team. You say, oh, you know what? I know somebody, right? I'm going to reach out to them. It makes it easier. And, especially in a remote world, is super important to make sure there are these connections and that communication is facilitated. And this is one of the 1,000 ways in which you can do it. So this is how we structure the onboarding program. And after the first week, each role has their role-specific onboarding program where they are probably much more closer to their team and they really learn what's their job about.
Cool. Well, that's very, very interesting because we've also grown a lot the last couple of years. Not everything is relative, so not at all at your level, but like maintaining that company culture is always a challenge. But then you also have the cultural, the remote component of that in Superside, which also makes it a bit more difficult as well, I assume. So I think what would be interesting is to understand if you've had any challenges along the way where you felt that, okay, our culture now has been stretched too far from core or from our principles. How can we get back on track or make adjustments? So any examples there, or has it been smooth sailing?
Absolutely no smooth sailing. But I think something that happened in Superside, and I think was extremely smart, is that we updated and reviewed our principles looking at the different stages where we were, right? So something that is maybe extremely important in a first stage becomes less and less important as you go. And we tried to design and update our principles to kind of follow the growth of the company. I strongly believe that principles or values are not something that you set in stone once and they're there forever. But the goal is to really guide the company and guide the behavior of everybody in the company in a certain direction. And by definition, there are some behaviors that you have to influence more in a stage of the company and a little bit less, right? In a second stage. I'll give you an example. We reviewed our principles around a year ago, probably. And one of those that we added this time that was not there before is roll up your sleeves. Why we did it? Because when we were 100 people and trying to, make this company work somehow and, make sure that we were doing a good job, everybody was doing everything. So it was easy to roll up your sleeve, right? By definition, like that was the whole job. And then we started growing. And of course, all the teams got more structured. I went from doing all the interviews by myself, all of them, to having a team doing it. Right? So it might be, maybe a temptation to start getting a little bit more far from the day-to-day, or think that maybe there's something you shouldn't do anymore, or start thinking that, now that we have such a structure, maybe the more senior roles should be less involved, etc. Well, with this principle, we really wanted to influence behavior and say, no, like everybody still does the job. There's no, a job that is too humble or, something that you cannot do, right? Everybody should be able to do that. So I think we were smart and we did good in trying to adapt our principles to what we really needed. Which doesn't mean changing the culture. It just means focusing on the areas that are the most important. And I think you mentioned before, right? You touched on culture and the remote work, and I find it always very interesting because I always get this question, like, how can you maintain culture in a remote environment? And probably the biggest point against working remote for many companies is we need to keep our culture. So I have a strong opinion on this, right? Where I think the office and the physical environment is for sure reflecting the culture. So how you design the layout of the office, the posters you put there, but also the events that you organize there, right? All of those reflect your culture. But that is not your culture. Like the culture is about what you think is true. How do you make decisions? How do you evaluate behaviors? What is acceptable? What is not acceptable? What is encouraged? How do you manage the natural trade-offs that come up whenever you make a decision. Like, that is the culture. And then the culture can be reflected in many ways. How do you manage the office is one of them, right? What happens in the office, and the feeling, the how you feel when you're in office is part of that, but that is not the culture. So for sure, the remote world loses that part, but acquires other things, and you need to think about a specific way to approach it. But you can have a very strong culture without an office. So 100%.
Absolutely. No, I'm very, very good point. But I see your enthusiasm
Yes,
on this
I really
topic, and
believe so.
I do. You have some very, very valid points here. So that is really, really good. In terms of the time zones, we mentioned, or you mentioned US and Europe. How has that affected the company and the way of working with the time zone differences?
Yes, so I think it affects the way of working by making everybody a little bit more intentional about it. The first time you join Superside, and this was my feeling when I joined, but I hear this from a lot of people that join, is that this looks like super daunting when you join. You know that there are people in another time zone. You have no idea how to organize. Like, are they sleeping? Are they working? How do we manage this, right? How do I talk about time zones? Like, now I cannot say anymore, let's meet at 3 p.m. But we need to say, let's meet at 3 p.m. UTC, Central Europe time, whatever you want to use, right? Otherwise, you're going to get this question, like, 3 p.m. for whom? For you? For me? Right? So this is the thing. I think, again, it sounds more tricky than what it is when you join, and you start then, getting used to this. So first of all, we are international, so we work across a lot of time zones, but being remote, we are also flexible, which means yes, we work usually standard working hours in your time zone, but this doesn't set a specific start of the day or end of the day. So you realize that yes, time zone is a thing, but there are other things that are involved, and probably it's more about how people like to work. So for some things is relatively easy. So whenever we have a meeting at the company level, we know that there's a sweet point, right? In the day where is good for everybody, and you probably will have some people having coffee, some others having lunch while that meeting happens, or maybe our APAC people getting ready to close the day and probably sometimes go to bed also. But there's a sweet point there, and then of course you have to learn to work with that in your advantage, but also considering it as a limitation sometimes. So for example, that if you have to work with somebody in a different time zone, you have to give them feedback for a project, or you need to give them approval for something by a specific hour, because otherwise they won't be able to act on it. So you need to keep that in mind while you work, but it gets easier as you work. You start understanding what are the usual working hours, being it flexibility or being it time zone of the people you work with, and you start adapting, and that can be like really used at your advantage, because that happens for me, for example, in my team, where I have maybe the morning to organize something and really understand what is the type of direction I want to give to the team, and then I give it in the morning, and then they can work for it for their whole morning and afternoon, and I'll have it done by the morning, right? Which is great. Or I can be, or sometimes on the contrary, right? I can be a little bit delayed, and I can say, hey, I will work on this stuff later in the day as the last thing, because anyway, whenever I give direction on this, I know that there's somebody in the team that still has half of their day to work on it. So I can play around with that.
Yeah.
So it's a matter of understanding it and trying to reduce as much as possible the negative parts and taking advantage of the positive.
Makes sense. That sounds good. Good description of your setup, and also some advice for people that are considering remote. And on that note, what type of advice would you give to I don't know, a VP talent of a scale up that's looking to move to a remote setup? We could spend, I don't know, the full day talking about that, but
I think so.
shoot me three advice maybe that comes to mind that you think about that's important.
Yeah, I think there's one big advice, and then everything follows. And the big one is that you cannot move a company from an office environment to remotely without being extremely intentional about it. And I think that being intentional is the key word regarding remote work. So there are a lot of things that in a physical environment happen organically that in a remote environment don't. And the contrary is true. So there is some things that you have to build at company level intentionally to make that work. So for example, you have to work on communication. In a physical world, communication happens organically all the time. You see people talking in the hallway, you get a word, you see somebody that is happy or angry, or they enter the office in the morning and you see them that didn't have a good day, right? And all of that just happens, and managers behave according to it, and communication is shared just as it is. In a remote environment, that doesn't happen. So you have to think about how you communicate with the company, and the right word there is over communication. Somebody once told me that when you feel like a broken record, like the moment you have that feeling, then probably that is when you communicated enough, right?
Yeah.
So you have to develop all of that, right? How do we communicate? How do we make sure the message is received by everybody? The second part is remote work comes usually with a lot of flexibility, which means organizing your day as you want, which is a great benefit and something I personally love about working remotely. That also means, though, you have to put the teams in the position to work as independently as possible. So processes need to be well-defined, resources need to be easy to find, and you should put people in a position to be as independent as possible when they work. So no things that are left unsaid, or you have to reach out to your colleague to figure out. Everything needs to be well documented. And then probably the last part is to train the managers to do that. Moving to remote, but also being remote involves much more effort from a leadership point of view. They need to figure out how to support their teams adapting to remote, but also living remote, right? So you almost need to be, managers almost need to be like remote coaches, where they teach the team, for example, to stop working at a certain point, right? If the laptop is in your living room, you probably won't ever stop. So you need to get used to that. You need to learn how to connect to your team when you don't see them every day, right? So when you jump on a call with somebody, you have no idea which kind of day they had, right? Maybe they just come from a meeting where they decided something and the process was successful and everybody's very happy. Or maybe you meet them and they're very worried about something, work-wise and personal-wise. Again, in an office, you see them. They are sitting there at their desk. You see if they're happy, not very happy, if they received a call and they're worried. In a remote environment, you don't. So you need to build that level of empathy to understand what is happening and also really work on the relationship much more and build a little bit of psychological safety in the relationship with your direct reports. So there's a lot of work to be done there also around making sure people in your team feel connected. Again, physical world, they are all sitting together. They probably have coffee together every day. They go to lunch together, right? In a remote environment, this doesn't happen. And again, it falls on the manager to have this task, right? Making sure they feel connected, they create bonds, they feel better at work because of that. So there's a lot of management effort there, and I think managers should be supported.
Fantastic. Great summary there, Marta. I want to wrap this up with a fire round, just some quick answers to some questions, and then you are dismissed. All right. So first question: what's the best part of your job?
The people.
The people. Good answer. Next one is: what are you most proud of since joining Superside?
Building the team, I think.
Good. The talent team or the whole company?
Talent team first, of course, but the whole company.
Cool. All right, last question. What's the one thing you would have done differently in your first 90 days as VP Talent?
I would have probably taken more time to understand the big picture of the challenges that were thrown at me. And that probably would have limited some mistakes down the line.
Cool. Makes sense. All right, Marta. So thank you so much for joining. Fantastic insight and advice. Really appreciate you taking your time to share this with the audience.
Thank you. I really enjoyed our chat.
Cheers. Likewise. Take care.
Bye.